Ambient sound, wind through high canopy, distant water, boots on loose shale and wet earth. A headlamp beam swings across a wall of rhododendron, dark, waxy leaves glistening with moisture. Fog moves between the trunks like something breathing. The sound is thin, too thin for July. You learn to read the forest the way a sailor reads water. You learn what it sounds like when it's healthy and settled, what it sounds like when weather's coming, what it sounds like when something big has moved through recently and everything is holding still, waiting for permission to start again. I was 900 feet below a ridgeline in a drainage so steep I was using rhododendron branches to keep from sliding. It was 20 minutes past sunset on the second day of a search for a missing hiker, a 31-year-old woman solo, last confirmed at a backcountry shelter 41 hours prior. I was alone. My nearest team member was a mile and a half northeast on the opposite side of the ridge. The fog had settled into the hollow around 5 o'clock and hadn't lifted. The forest was wrong. I don't mean quiet. Quiet is something I understand. Animals bed down. Birds stop calling. Wind dies. That's quiet. What I was hearing or not hearing was different. It was the absence of the ambient. No insects, no tree frogs, no settling sounds in the canopy. The creek 20 yards below me was running, but even that seemed muted, as though the water had been turned down. The air had a thickness to it that went beyond humidity. It felt pressurized. I stopped to check my GPS. No satellite lock. I'd lost it 10 minutes earlier on the descent, which wasn't unusual in these drainages. The ridgeline cuts the sky to a narrow band and the canopy closes the rest. I was navigating by compass bearing and the sound of the creek below me. That's when I heard the call. It came from below. From down in the drainage, deeper into the hollow, past where the fog erased everything. A single, sustained vocalization. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. High, then dropping. Musical almost. Not a bird. Not a fox. Not a barred owl or a screech owl or any of the animals I've spent 20 years identifying by sound alone in these mountains. It sounded like a woman's voice, calling out from somewhere in the fog, which should have been impossible. The missing hiker's last known position was 2.5 miles from where I stood. No other searcher was assigned to this drainage, and the sound didn't come from the direction of the trail or the shelter or any route a person on foot would logically take. It came from the deepest part of the hollow, from a place where no trail existed, where the terrain dropped away into a tangle of rock and rhododendron and old-growth hemlock that hadn't seen a boot print in years. I stood on that slope, my headlamp cutting a useless 15-foot tunnel through the fog, and I listened. My hand moved to my radio. I stopped. Because what I was about to report, that I had heard a human voice in a section of wilderness where no human should have been, would change the entire trajectory of the search. It would pull teams off their assigned grids. It would redirect resources. It would raise hope. And some part of me, a part I had never consulted before in 20 years of doing this work, told me that the sound I had just heard had not been made by the woman we were looking for. It had been made for me. Part 2. The witness. My name is Len Gerhardt. At the time this happened, I had spent 21 years with the National Park Service, the last 14 on backcountry assignment in the southern Appalachians. I'm going to keep the specific park and district vague, and I'll change certain names, because some of this involves an open case, and because some of what I'm about to describe falls outside the scope of what I was willing to put in an official report. I grew up in East Tennessee, outside Maryville at the foot of the Smokies. I started volunteering with search and rescue when I was 17. I joined the Park Service at 23. By the time of this incident, I had participated in over 140 search operations, led 32 of them, and spent more nights alone in the Appalachian Backcountry than I spent in my own home in some years. I tell you this so you understand. I am the wrong person to have this experience. I don't spook. I'm not imaginative. I don't see things in the dark that aren't there. I'm a man who trusts his instruments, his training, and his senses, roughly in that order. I have encountered every animal these mountains produce: black bear at arm's length, boar in heavy cover, rattlesnakes on rock ledges, the occasional bobcat in the laurel. None of them ever made me feel what I felt in that drainage. I have never told this story in full. I've referenced it carefully to a few people, other rangers, a couple of retired SAR guys I trust. They listened. Some of them nodded. One of them told me his own story, which was worse. None of them suggested I was mistaken. None of them suggested I was lying. What I'm going to tell you is what I observed, what I heard, what I saw, what my instruments recorded. I'm going to present it the way I would present evidence, chronologically, precisely, without embellishment. You can decide what it means. I already have. Part 3. The region people think of the Appalachians as gentle mountains. They see the photographs, soft green ridges rolling to the horizon, wildflower meadows, morning mist in the valleys, and they think it looks peaceful, easy, approachable. It is none of those things. The southern Appalachians are the oldest major mountain range on Earth. They've been standing in one form or another for over 400 million years. What you see now, the rounded summits, the gradual-looking slopes, is the worn skeleton of something that was once higher than the modern Alps. Time and weather have ground them down, but what remains is among the most complex, dense, and biologically rich terrain on the continent. The forest here is layered in a way that flatland woods are not. The canopy, oak, hickory, tulip poplar, beech, forms a ceiling 60 to 90 feet above you. Below that is the understory, dogwood, sourwood, silverbell. Below that, in the moist hollows and along the creek drainages, is the rhododendron. This is the part that changes everything. Rhododendron maximum, great laurel, grows in thickets so dense that they form what the old-timers call laurel hells. Walls of twisted, interlocking stems covered in dark evergreen leaves that block light, block sight, block passage. You cannot walk through a laurel hell. You push, you crawl, you force your way between stems that bend but don't break, and in 15 minutes of effort you might cover 30 feet. Your clothing catches. Your pack catches. Your visibility drops to nothing. You lose the sky. You lose direction. You lose the ability to see the ground under your feet. When someone leaves the trail in this country and enters the rhododendron, they are functionally invisible. A helicopter with thermal imaging cannot see through the canopy. A search dog can follow a scent trail only until the chemical signature degrades or disperses, and a human searcher, even one who knows these woods, moves at a pace that makes grid coverage agonizingly slow. The terrain compounds everything. The mountains here are cut by thousands of drainages, steep-sided hollows carved by creeks that run down from the ridges toward the larger rivers in the valleys below. Some of these hollows are over 1,000 feet deep. The slopes run 30 to 45 degrees. The footing is leaf litter over loose soil over rock, and when it's wet, which is often, because these mountains generate their own weather, pulling moisture up from the lowlands and wringing it out as fog and rain, the slopes become treacherous. This is where people disappear. Not on the trails, not on the ridges, in the drainages, in the hollows, in the laurel, in places where the forest closes over you like a fist and the nearest maintained trail might as well be on another continent. And when I say disappear, I mean it literally. Not found injured, not found dead, not found. Part 4. The case on July 22nd, the park received notification that a solo hiker named, I'll call her Sarah Landon, had not checked in with her emergency contact as planned. Sarah was 31, experienced, in excellent physical condition. She'd thru-hiked the AT 2 years earlier and had completed dozens of backcountry trips in the Smokies and surrounding ranges. She was not a novice. She was not careless. Her itinerary had her hiking a loop route through the backcountry 4 days, 3 nights using designated shelters. She had signed in at the first shelter on the evening of July 20th. Her handwriting in the register was normal. She noted the weather, mentioned seeing a black bear on the trail, and wrote that she planned to reach the next shelter by the following afternoon. Standard entries. She never reached the second shelter. No one was alarmed at first. Cell service is non-existent in most of the backcountry, and check-in windows have some flexibility built in. It wasn't until the evening of the 22nd, when Sarah missed her second scheduled contact, that her emergency contact called the park. We initiated a hasty search on the morning of July 23rd. Teams covered the trail between the 2 shelters, approximately 9 miles of maintained path along a ridgeline, with several trail junctions and side routes. Sarah's car was still at the trailhead. No one at the second shelter or any of the intermediate campsites had seen her. By the afternoon of the 23rd, we brought in dogs. The handler started at the first shelter, Sarah's last confirmed location, and the dogs picked up a strong scent trail heading north along the trail, consistent with her planned route. The trail was clear for approximately 2.5 miles. Then it diverged. At a point roughly halfway between the two shelters, the scent trail left the maintained path. It did not follow any of the mapped side trails. It went east off-trail directly into a steep drainage, a hollow that dropped over 1,200 feet in less than a mile. Dense hardwood forest, heavy rhododendron below 4,000 feet. No trail, no old roadbed, no reason anyone would choose to descend into that drainage. The dogs followed the scent downslope for approximately a quarter mile. Then they lost it. The handler described the loss as abrupt, not a gradual fading consistent with time and weather degradation. The dogs tracked strongly, confidently, and then stopped. Both animals circled at the same point, a small clearing in the rhododendron, maybe 8 feet across on a steep slope above the main creek, and could not continue. They showed stress indicators, panting, whining, reluctance to move forward. The handler noted it was the most pronounced refusal she had seen from either dog in her career. Below that point, there was no scent, in any direction. I was assigned to the lower portion of that drainage for the evening search. Solo. The terrain was too dense and steep for safe team movement after dark, and the operational logic, which I understood and agreed with at the time, was that a single experienced ranger could move more quietly, listen more effectively, and cover the ground with less risk than a group crashing through the laurel. I entered the drainage from the old logging road at the bottom at 7:40 p.m. on July 23rd and began working upslope. Part 5. First Anomaly. For the first hour, the search was unremarkable. I moved carefully along the creek, sweeping my headlamp across the banks, checking for footprints, fabric, gear, anything that might indicate Sarah had descended this far. The creek was typical for these drainages, maybe 3 feet wide, ankle to shin deep, running over sandstone and shale with small pools at the base of each little cascade. The rhododendron formed a tunnel over the water in places, and I moved through it the way you move through any tight passage, slowly, methodically, clearing branches with my arms and checking footing before committing my weight. At approximately 8:50 p.m., 40 minutes before full dark, I found the first track. A boot print. Left foot. Clear impression in a patch of alluvial mud on the east bank of the creek. Lug sole, consistent with a mid-weight hiking boot. The print was relatively fresh, edges sharp, no insect trails across it, no leaf debris settled into the impression. Based on conditions, I estimated it was no more than 2 days old. I marked it, photographed it, noted the GPS coordinates. I still had marginal satellite lock at the lower elevation, and continued searching the area for additional tracks. I found one more. Right foot. 47 yards upstream on the opposite bank in a different patch of exposed mud. Same boot pattern, same apparent freshness, same size. Oriented uphill back toward the ridge, 2 tracks, 47 yards apart, on opposite sides of the creek, with nothing between them. No prints in the creek bed, which was soft shale that would hold an impression. No scuff marks on the rocks. No broken branches in the rhododendron connecting the 2 points. Just 2 footprints, isolated, as if the person who made them had taken 2 steps across 50 yards of forest without touching the ground in between. I've tracked people through these woods for 2 decades. I've followed boot prints across rock, through water, up slopes of loose soil where the impressions were barely a shadow. I know how tracks connect. I know the stride patterns, the weight shifts, the compression fractures in disturbed leaves. Between those 2 prints, there should have been a path. Even on hard ground, even across rock, a person leaves sign, displaced pebbles, bruised moss, broken spider web strung between branches. There was nothing. I expanded my search radius. I spent 20 minutes circling, checking every patch of soft ground within 100 yards. I found no additional tracks. Sarah, if it was Sarah, had apparently touched the earth twice in this drainage and left no other trace. I was kneeling beside the second print, studying the tread pattern when the forest changed. The katydid stopped first. then the tree frogs, then something I hadn't consciously been hearing, the background rustle of small creatures moving in leaf litter, the constant low-frequency vibration of a living forest went away. It didn't fade. It stopped, as if every living thing in that hollow had frozen in place simultaneously and was holding its breath. I stood up. I turned my headlamp off, old habit, part instinct. In full darkness, your ears work better. You stop relying on the narrow cone of what you can see and you start using the full sphere of what you can hear. I heard two things. The first was a knock, a sharp, percussive impact, wood on wood, from the slope above me and to the north, loud enough to carry clearly through the fog, which meant it was either close or it was very loud. One strike, then silence. The second, roughly 10 seconds later, was an identical knock from a different position. South of me, below me, down the drainage from the direction I had come. Two knocks, two locations, bracketing me. I knew the explanations. Dead snags falling, branches releasing after thermal contraction. A woodpecker, though no woodpecker works after dark. A bear breaking a branch. But I had been in these woods in every condition and every season, and what I heard did not match any of those patterns. The strikes were too clean, too uniform, too symmetrically placed. They sounded like signals. I keyed my radio. Base Gerhardt, I'm in the east drainage, lower section. I've located two partial tracks, marking and photographing. I've also got some unusual acoustic activity. Wood impacts, two separate points above and below my position. Any other teams in this drainage? Over. Static. Then broken. Negative. Gerhardt, you are only unit. That grid. The radio was marginal. The terrain was cutting the signal. I would be able to transmit in fragments but wouldn't be able to hold a real conversation until I gained elevation or reached the logging road. I clipped the radio back to my vest. I stood in the dark, in the silence, and I waited for the forest to start again. It didn't. Documentary narration. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in the United States, averaging over 12 million visitors per year. Its backcountry encompasses over 500,000 acres of wilderness, steep terrain, dense old-growth forest, and hundreds of miles of unmaintained drainage systems that have never been formally surveyed. It is also the site of some of the most enduring unsolved disappearances in American outdoor history. In June 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin vanished during a family outing near Spence Field on the Appalachian Trail. Despite one of the largest search operations in park history, involving over 1,400 searchers, the Green Berets, FBI agents, and National Guard helicopters, no confirmed trace of the boy was ever found. The search produced one anomalous report. A family camping in a nearby area reported seeing a rough, disheveled figure carrying something across a clearing at dusk. The sighting was never explained. Dennis Martin was never found. In 1976, 16-year-old Trenny Gibson disappeared during a school trip on the Appalachian Trail near Clingman's Dome. She was seen on the trail by classmates and then was gone. The search found nothing. No pack, no clothing, no remains. The trail she had been walking runs along an exposed ridgeline with steep drainages falling away on both sides. Whether she left the trail voluntarily or involuntarily has never been determined. In 1981, 58-year-old Polly Melton walked ahead of her companions on a trail in the Smokies and was never seen again. The trail she disappeared from was well maintained and moderately trafficked. The forest on either side was dense. The search was extensive. Nothing was found. These cases are part of a larger pattern that extends across the Appalachian Range and, indeed, across the national park system. Experienced hikers, healthy hikers, people with no reason to leave the trail, gone. In terrain that is searched thoroughly, sometimes multiple times, with dogs, aircraft, and large ground teams, gone without a trace. The conventional explanations falls into inaccessible areas, flash flooding, animal predation, hypothermia, account for many wilderness disappearances, but they do not account for the absence of evidence. A person who falls from a cliff leaves a body. A person taken by a bear leaves remains, drag marks, disturbed soil. A person who dies of exposure in the woods is found, eventually, by the search teams or by subsequent hikers. Unless they aren't. Unless something about certain disappearances, certain places, certain conditions, resists explanation in a way that the institutional language of incident reports and case files is not designed to accommodate. Part 6. Escalation. Lend your heart. I turned my headlamp back on and continued upslope. The decision was procedural. I had a grid to cover, and standing still in the dark wasn't going to find Sarah Landon. Whatever the knocking was, it wasn't something I could investigate from my current position, and the protocol for anomalous sound in a search environment is to note it, report it when possible, and continue the assignment unless there's an immediate safety threat. That's what I told myself. Continue the assignment. The fog was heavier now. My headlamp created a white sphere around me, maybe 12 to 15 feet of visibility, then a wall of vapor and dark leaves. The rhododendron pressed in from both sides. I was following the creek upslope, aiming for the point where the dogs had lost the scent, which should have been roughly 400 vertical feet above me. At 9:30 p.m. I became aware of movement on my left, upslope, east of the creek, maybe 35 yards into the understory. It was subtle at first. A branch bending, a compression of leaves under weight. The kind of sound a large animal makes when it's moving slowly through heavy cover. I stopped and listened. The movement stopped. I waited 15 seconds and took 4 steps. The movement resumed. Same distance. Same direction relative to me. Paralleling. I have been paralleled by black bears before. It happens occasionally, particularly with sows who have cubs nearby. They'll shadow you through the forest, keeping a fixed distance, monitoring your trajectory until they're satisfied you aren't a threat. The behavior is recognizable. The bear moves when you move, stops when you stop, and eventually peels off when you pass through her territory. This felt different, and I need to be precise about why, because the difference matters. A bear in heavy cover is not quiet. Even a cautious sow makes noise, snapping branches, heavy footfalls, the occasional huff or jaw pop. What I was hearing was quieter than a bear. The footfalls were lighter in pattern but heavier in compression, as if something was distributing significant weight very carefully. And the movement wasn't four-legged. I could make out individual steps alternating bipedal, 2 feet, not 4. I swept my headlamp east into the rhododendron. The beam penetrated maybe 8 feet into the thicket before it died against the leaves. I saw nothing. No eye shine, no shape, nothing but vegetation and fog. I said loudly and clearly, "Hello, Forest Service, if you can hear me, identify yourself." Nothing. The forest held its silence. I continued upslope. The movement continued, matching me step for step, maintaining that fixed distance, close enough to hear clearly, far enough to remain invisible in the cover, and then I smelled it. It came on a drift of air from the east, from the direction of whatever was pacing me. A heavy, organic smell. Not rot, not decomposition, something alive. Musky, layered, deeply animal, like wet fur and turned soil and something acrid underneath, something glandular. I've worked around bears for 20 years. I know what a bear smells like, the oily musk of their coat, the sweetness of their breath from foraging on berries. This was not bear. It was ranker, sharper, and it carried a quality I can only describe as concentration. As if whatever produced this scent was large enough that its body chemistry filled the air the way a wood stove fills a cabin. My hand went to my sidearm. I unsnapped the retention strap but didn't draw. I kept walking. At 10:15 p.m. the paralleling movement stopped. Not gradually, it stopped. One moment I could hear it matching my steps, and the next there was nothing on that slope but fog and timber. Whatever had been pacing me had either frozen in place or moved away with a silence that shouldn't have been possible for something that heavy. I stood still and scanned the slope with my light. Nothing. The rhododendron was motionless. The fog hung in the branches like gauze. I continued upslope for another 20 minutes, moving slower now, checking my compass frequently. The terrain was steepening and the creek was narrowing to a trickle. I should have been approaching the area where the dogs lost the scent. At 10:40 p.m. my headlamp flickered. Fresh batteries installed that morning. LED array rated for 40 hours of continuous use. The light dimmed, surged, dimmed again, then steadied. It remained at perhaps 70% of its normal output for the next 10 minutes, giving everything a yellowish cast and reducing my visible range to about 10 feet. I switched to my backup, a handheld flashlight, also fresh batteries. It functioned normally. I turned off the headlamp and continued with the handheld. 2 minutes later, the whistle came. Same pattern I'd heard at the beginning of the night. 2 notes, rising, falling. Coming from directly above me on the slope, maybe 60 yards uphill. And then, immediately, within 1 second, the same whistle from behind me. Below, maybe 70 yards downslope. 2 calls, 2 locations. The same sound, the same pattern, played almost simultaneously from positions that were over 100 yards apart. One animal can produce a call that echoes. One animal cannot produce 2 identical calls from 2 widely separated positions at the same time, which meant either there were 2 sources coordinating with each other, or the acoustic properties of the drainage were producing a reflection so precise that it was indistinguishable from the original. I have worked in these hollows for 14 years. I have never heard an echo that clean. These drainages are acoustic nightmares. The irregular walls, the vegetation, the fog all conspire to muffle, distort, and scatter sound. A clean echo in a rhododendron-choked hollow is not consistent with the physics of the environment. 2 sources, coordinating. I checked my radio, static. I was too deep in the drainage for transmission. I was alone, documentary narration. It is worth noting the range of natural explanations available for the phenomena commonly reported in deep Appalachian wilderness at night. Fox vocalizations, particularly those of the red fox, include a high-pitched, 2-note call that can carry significant distances and is routinely mistaken for a human voice or whistle. Barred owls produce a repertoire of calls that, under certain conditions, can sound like screaming, laughing, or sustained moaning. Bobcats, though rarely heard, produce screams that have been described as otherworldly by experienced outdoorsmen who were hearing them for the first time. Wood knocks have been attributed to falling dead timber, thermal stress fractures in standing snags, and territorial drumming behavior by pileated woodpeckers, though the latter is not known to occur after dark. The sensation of being watched or followed in dense forest is a well-documented psychological response to sensory deprivation and hypervigilance, particularly in low-visibility conditions such as fog. Scent loss by tracking dogs has numerous mundane explanations. Terrain that disrupts air currents, water crossings that dilute chemical traces, rocky substrate that does not hold scent, and elapsed time allowing UV degradation of skin cells and sweat compounds. The dramatic, abrupt scent loss described by some handlers is less easily explained, but is not without precedent in SAR literature. In Appalachian folklore, particularly in the Cherokee tradition that predates European settlement of the region by thousands of years, the deep mountain forests are populated by entities that operate at the boundary between the natural and the other. The raven mocker, a shape-shifting being associated with death and darkness, is said to fly unseen over the mountains at night. The Ua, sometimes described as a great maddening creature of the high wilderness, was said to drive people insane by its very presence. Throughout the mountain communities, a simple prohibition persists to this day. Do not whistle in the woods at night. The reason given varies. Some say whistling attracts snakes. Some say it attracts spirits. Some say it calls things that live in the hollows, things that will answer, and once they answer will follow. These are stories. They are cultural artifacts. They are not evidence. But they are the accumulated testimony of people who have lived in these mountains for generations, people who knew the woods intimately, who depended on them for survival, and who nonetheless identified certain places and certain hours as belonging to something other than themselves. Part 7. The Clearing, Len Gerhardt. At approximately 11:05 p.m., I reached the clearing where the dogs had lost the scent. I knew it before I checked the coordinates because of the flagging tape the dog handler had left that afternoon, strips of orange vinyl tied to rhododendron branches at the perimeter. The clearing was small, maybe 8 feet across, a gap in the canopy created by a large tulip poplar that had fallen years ago and left an opening in the overstory. The fallen trunk was still there, moss-covered, slowly rotting back into the soil. The ground was a mix of disturbed leaf litter and bare earth. I swept my light across the clearing, and I stopped. There were marks on the ground, not boot prints, not animal tracks, drag marks. 3 parallel lines, each about 2 inches wide, scored into the bare earth at the center of the clearing. They ran roughly east-west for about 4 feet, then stopped, as if 3 fingers or 3 claws or 3 sticks had been dragged firmly across the ground. The marks were not fresh. The edges were slightly weathered, and a few leaves had settled into the furrows. But they were recent days, not weeks. They were deliberate. They were uniform in depth and spacing, and they did not continue beyond the 4-foot span. They began and ended in the middle of the clearing, connected to nothing. I photographed them. I measured the spacing, approximately 3.5 inches between each line. I noted that the tulip poplar's root system could theoretically produce furrows if the trunk shifted during decomposition, but the marks were 12 feet from the fallen trunk and oriented perpendicular to it. I was crouched over these marks, trying to construct a rational explanation when the smell came back. Stronger this time. Much stronger. Not drifting on a breeze, the air was dead still, but present, as if whatever produced it had moved closer while I wasn't looking. I stood up. Fog had shifted while I was focused on the ground. It had thickened around the clearing, reducing the space to a small pocket of visibility surrounded by white nothing. My flashlight beam hit the fog at 8 feet and stopped dead. I could not see the rhododendron. I could not see the fallen tulip poplar I had been standing next to seconds earlier. The world had contracted to an 8-foot circle of leaf litter and bare earth and those 3 scored lines. The silence was absolute. Not reduced, absolute. The creek was gone. The drip of fog from branches was gone. My own breathing was the only sound in the world, and even that seemed dampened, swallowed before it could travel more than a few inches from my mouth. I turned slowly. A full 360-degree sweep, flashlight extended. On the second pass, I saw it. Part 8. Contact. I need to describe this carefully, because accuracy matters more here than anywhere else in this account, and because the temptation to either exaggerate or minimize is strong. At the northern edge of the clearing, or what I believed was the northern edge, based on my last compass reading, standing in the fog just beyond the range where my flashlight could resolve detail, there was a figure. It was upright, standing on 2 legs, still. So completely still that for the first 2 seconds I questioned whether it was a figure at all, whether it was a standing dead snag, or a trunk, or a shape created by overlapping rhododendron branches. I wanted it to be any of those things. It was not any of those things. The shape was tall, significantly taller than me, and I'm 6 feet even. I would estimate what I saw was between 7 and 7.5 feet in height, though the fog and the absence of reference points make precise measurement impossible. What I can tell you with certainty is that the proportions were wrong. The torso was too long relative to the legs. The shoulders were too broad relative to the head. The arms, I could see the outline of arms against the marginally lighter fog behind the figure, extended well below the waist. The head was large but sat forward on the neck, not upright, giving the silhouette a hunched quality despite the overall height. It was dark. My flashlight should have illuminated it at that distance, 12, maybe 15 feet. Instead, the beam seemed to lose coherence as it reached the figure, as if the light was being absorbed rather than reflected. I could see the silhouette. I could see the outline. I could not see the surface. No texture, no color, no detail. Just a shape that was darker than the fog behind it, standing at the edge of my circle of visibility, watching me. I say watching because of what happened next. I shifted my flashlight, moved the beam slightly to the left, away from the figure to check my peripheral space. When I brought the beam back, the figure had moved. Not much. A step. Maybe 2, but it was closer. The shift was subtle enough that I might have questioned it if I hadn't been staring directly at the thing's position 30 seconds earlier and memorized the gap between it and a branch I could see behind it. That gap had narrowed. It had moved while I moved my light, and it had stopped the instant I pointed the beam back at it. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not reach for my radio or my sidearm. I stood with my flashlight locked on that shape, and I experienced something that I have never felt before or since in the woods. the absolute certain bone-deep knowledge that I was in the presence of something that was evaluating me. Not threatened by me, not afraid, evaluating, deciding, patient in a way that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with a kind of intelligence that I do not have a framework for. The smell was overwhelming. It filled the clearing. It was in my clothes, my hair, the back of my throat. My eyes watered, my stomach clenched. I took one step backward, then another. I did not lower my light. I did not turn around. I moved the way you move when you know, the way prey knows, the way something ancient in the base of your brain knows that turning your back would be a mistake you would not survive. I backed out of the clearing. I backed into the rhododendron. I felt the branches press against my pack, my shoulders, my legs. I kept the light pointed forward into the fog at the space where the figure had been standing. It was gone, not retreated, not moved. Gone. The space where it had stood was empty fog, as if it had never been there. I turned and moved downslope, not running. You cannot run through rhododendron on a steep slope in fog, but I moved with an urgency I had never applied to a retreat before. I used the creek as a guide, followed the sound of water, kept it on my right, descended as fast as the terrain and my control would allow. Behind me, once at a distance I couldn't judge, I heard the whistle again. 2 notes, rising then falling, my pattern. One more time, then nothing. The insects came back at the lower elevations. The frogs started up. The forest resumed its normal soundtrack with a completeness that felt almost obscene, as if nothing had happened, as if the silence had never existed, as if the hollow behind me was just a hollow and not a place where something stood in the fog and watched a man with the patience of deep water. I reached the logging road at 12:20 a.m. I sat in my vehicle. I turned on the engine and the heater and the headlights. I sat in the warm cab and I stared at the dark line of trees at the edge of the road and I waited for my hands to stop shaking. They didn't stop for 40 minutes. Part 9. Aftermath. I radioed base from the logging road. I reported the tracks, the drag marks, the flagging tape confirmation of the scent loss site. I recommended a full ground team for that section of the drainage at first light. I did not report the figure. I reported the auditory anomalies as unidentified wildlife vocalizations and wood impacts, and recommended that subsequent solo assignments in that drainage be reconsidered due to uncertain large animal activity. I filed my written report the next morning. It was thorough, accurate, and incomplete. Every factual detail was correct. The tracks, the marks, the GPS coordinates, the atmospheric conditions, the timing, all of it. What I left out was the figure in the clearing, the paralleling movement, the coordinated whistle calls, and the smell. I left them out because I knew, with the institutional instinct of someone who has worked in government service for 2 decades, that including them would accomplish nothing productive. The report would be flagged. I would be evaluated. The details I considered most important would be treated as symptoms of fatigue or stress or CO2 exposure, and the conversation would shift from what is happening in that drainage to what is happening with Len Gerhardt. I made a choice. I chose to stay credible so that my operational recommendations would be followed. And they were. The drainage was subsequently searched by teams, never solo, and never after dark. The search for Sarah Landon continued for 9 more days. Every section of that drainage was covered by ground teams. Dog teams were brought back twice. Helicopter flights were conducted daily when cloud cover allowed. Dive teams checked the deeper pools in the creek downstream. Cadaver dogs were brought in on day 6. Nothing was found. No pack, no clothing, no remains, no additional tracks beyond the 2 I had documented. The drag marks in the clearing were photographed by a subsequent team and noted in the report as indeterminate ground disturbance, possible animal activity. No further analysis was conducted. Sarah Landon has never been found. The official case summary describes her disappearance as probable misadventure in remote terrain with subsequent exposure and unrecovered remains. The report acknowledges the unexplained off-trail travel, the abrupt scent loss, and the absence of physical evidence, and attributes them to the inherent challenges of backcountry search operations in heavily forested, steep terrain with limited access and highly variable weather conditions. I have read that summary many times. The language is careful and professional. It says everything it can say and nothing it can't. It is the institutional equivalent of a shrug, an admission that we don't know what happened, wrapped in enough procedural terminology to obscure the fact that we don't know. I signed off on it because there was nothing else to sign off on. Part 10. What changed? Lend your heart. The voice is quieter now, slower, not less controlled, more careful, each sentence considered before it's spoken. I stayed with the service for another 3 years after that search. I continued backcountry patrols. I continued participating in search operations. I did my job, but something had shifted and I couldn't unshift it. The forest I had spent my career in, the forest I knew, trusted, understood, had revealed a gap in my understanding that I could not close. I had stood 12 feet from something that my training, my experience, and my knowledge of these mountains said should not exist. Something that was large, aware, intelligent, and utterly unidentifiable. Something that moved through a terrain I knew intimately with an ease and silence that suggested it was far more native to this place than I was, than any of us are. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. Places in the backcountry where the sound would drop for no reason. Stretches of trail where the dog teams consistently showed reluctance. Drainages that experienced searchers quietly avoided requesting for solo assignments, not because of terrain, not because of weather, but because of a feeling. A consensus that was never spoken aloud but was understood. I talked to a few people, carefully. Other rangers, SAR volunteers, wildlife techs who'd spent time in the deep backcountry. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I asked open-ended questions. Have you ever felt something off in the drainages? Have you ever had a search where the evidence didn't add up? Have you ever heard something in the woods that you couldn't explain? The answers surprised me. Not because they were dramatic, they weren't. They were cautious, understated, qualified. The same way mine would have been if someone had asked me, but the details were consistent. Wood knocks in empty hollows, sounds that tracked with you through the forest, the feeling of being observed from a fixed point in heavy cover, and in 2 cases from 2 people who did not know each other and had worked in different sections of the park years apart, the description of a shape in the woods. Large, upright, dark, still. Wrong. Neither of them had reported it. For the same reason I hadn't. I left the service in 2020, not dramatically. No confrontation, no breakdown, no single precipitating event. I just reached the point where I could no longer reconcile what I knew about these mountains with what the institution was willing to acknowledge about them. The gap between those 2 things had become too wide, and I was tired of standing in it. I live in a valley town now. I can see the Smokies from my kitchen window, the long blue ridgelines, soft looking in the morning haze. Beautiful, familiar. I know what's in those mountains. I know the trails, the shelters, the drainages, the creeks. I know the bears and the birds and the wildflowers and the salamanders. I know the fog and the rain and the way the light comes through the canopy in October. And I know there is something else. Something that occupies the spaces we haven't mapped. Something that moves through the laurel and the old growth and the deep hollows with an ownership that predates our presence in these mountains by an interval I do not want to calculate. Something that does not want to be seen and is very, very good at not being seen, except when it chooses otherwise. I don't know what happened to Sarah Landon. I don't know why she left the trail and descended into that drainage. I don't know why the dogs couldn't follow her scent past that clearing. I don't know what made those marks in the ground or who, or what made those boot prints that connected to nothing. But I know that the official explanation is not complete, and I suspect, though I cannot prove it, that the official explanation will never be complete, because the thing that would complete it lives in a space that our reports are not designed to describe and our institutions are not prepared to accept. People will keep hiking these mountains. They should. The Appalachians are magnificent. They are irreplaceable. They are among the great wild places left in this country, and they deserve to be experienced. But I will tell you what I tell my own family, what I would tell anyone who asked me honestly what I've learned in 21 years of working in the southern Appalachian Backcountry. Stay on the trail. Travel with others. Do not hike alone in the drainages. And if the forest goes quiet, if the insects stop, if the birds stop, if the air goes still and the light seems wrong and some part of you that you can't name tells you that the woods around you are no longer empty, trust that feeling. Turn around. Go back the way you came. Do not investigate. Do not call out. Do not whistle. Some disappearances don't begin when a person goes missing. They begin the moment something in the forest decides to pay attention. And by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the woods have already closed. Ambient sound returns, daytime forest. Full chorus, birdsong, wind in the canopy, the distant murmur of a creek. Normal, healthy, alive. Then gradually, so slowly you almost don't notice, the sound thins. The birdsong fades, the wind drops, the creek grows distant, silence. 5 seconds of absolute silence. A single whistle, 2 notes, rising then falling, distant, patient. The forest sound returns all at once, as if nothing happened.